As Beth said, I'm here today to talk about a study that we did comparing two different harvest methods of corn residue. And so I first wanted to start off and say thank you to the Iowa Beef Industry Council. They were the funder of this project, and so I thank them for their support and allowing us to do this research and share these results with you here today. So just a little bit of background on this. About 20 years ago, they started using chopping heads on combines. And the idea behind this is similar to the same reason we process grain in the feedlot industry. And basically, it's the more you break down that particle, the greater surface area there is for those microbes to actually work on that and break it down into organic matter. And the thought process behind this is that up here in the northern Midwest, the winters can be long and grueling and spend a lot of time below freezing. So they want to make the most of the days of getting organic matter that they can. So they decided to start chopping the corn residue. And this picture down here represents that. On the left, it's pretty easy to tell that the stalk was cut off a little bit higher, and the pieces, particle sizes are bigger in there compared to the chopping corn head that you can see on the right side of the screen there. And so, as I mentioned, it's become more common in recent years, but one thing to think about, and I think Jennifer set us up nicely for this, is that the farmer is not always the person who is going to have cattle out on those corn stalks. And sometimes what's good for the gander may not always be good for the goose. And we started getting questions here in Extension with our specialists and educators across the state saying that producers thought that their cows that were going out on these chopped stalks were actually coming back in thinner and poorer condition than the cattle that were out on the traditional, or what we called them in this study was standard. And so whenever cattle are grazing corn residue, really the most important element that's out there is the husk. And so the husk has the greatest energy. It's the highest energy portion of the plant, and we'll kind of look at some of that data later on. And it only makes up about 10% of the residue. So cattle have the ability to select. I'm sure everybody has seen cattle sort in a bunk. They do the same thing when they're out grazing. So they go after what they like, almost like a kid at a buffet. And so since it only makes up 10% of the residue, they get on it pretty quick and eat it up pretty quickly. And so this picture down here in the bottom left-hand part of the screen, this is one husk from each the chopped and the standard treatment. The one on the left is from the chopped treatment, and it's pretty easy to tell that it's frayed on the ends, and it looks a little bleached. And the reason for that is because it doesn't have that outer layer of the husk, the thicker layer that you can see on the standard one. And then I just showed another picture of our grazing field on the right-hand side of the screen, basically taking a picture like the one from the previous slide, showing the difference between the two different treatments that we grazed in this trial. So the objectives of this study were to compare cattle's ability to select and their performance. We used ruminally cannulated cattle to basically determine what the cattle were out there selecting. So that basically told us the quality of what the cattle were actually eating. And then we used stalkers cattle to determine how much quantity was actually out there, and the difference between these two harvest methods. And we hypothesized that chopping this residue may actually reduce cattle's ability to select the more digestible parts, being the husk and the leaf, and then this would cause a decrease in their performance and average daily gain. So this is our study design. We had 4 replications of each harvest method. On block 1, that was our west block, and so we had 2 replications of chop there, 2 of standard. And then on block 2, that was our east block. It was set up the same way. And so the total grazable area was almost 21 acres. And so this study took place at the Eastern Nebraska Research Extension and Education Center, which is near Mead, Nebraska. So if you go about 30 miles north of Lincoln and 30 miles west of Omaha, where those two lines would cross, is about where this research center is. And our paddocks were 2.7 acres, and the field yielded 220 bushels per acre. This was an irrigated field. But this satellite image on the screen that you're seeing right now, the more bleached area is where the study actually was. This isn't necessarily pertinent information, but outside of that, they harvested high moisture corn. And so that's why there's the difference between the shades of the two. But if you look into where the study actually was, you can kind of see bands. And it might just look like the satellite image is grainy, but that's actually the differences between our treatments that were picked up by a satellite image. And so the black represents the chopped and the red will represent the standard. So in this study, we used 40 steers. These cattle came in at about 5 weights, and they were assigned to either the chopped or the standard treatment. And then we also used 4 diet samplers, which this is kind of an example of what one of the diet samplers looked like. And so that's a cannula that goes directly into the rumen. And so you can reach in and pull out the contents of what they've eaten. But those cattle were were a little bit heavier than 1,000 pounds. And then on that east block, block 2 that we had talked about, they actually replaced 2 steers on that block. So on the west block, we had 6 steers. And then on the east block, we had 4 steers plus 1 diet sampler. And we use these diet samplers to do diet collections monthly. And so what that would look like is the cattle would be in the barn, and we would empty the contents that were already in the rumen, which is a better way than starting off your morning with coffee to wake you up if you were curious. And then we'd turn them out to graze for about an hour and a half. And then after they were done grazing, we'd bring them back into the chute and pull out the contents of what they had grazed. And then we later ran those samples in the lab to determine the energy and protein of them. But all groups were supplemented at 18.3 pounds of a dried distiller's grain supplement daily. And this was about 0.6% of the body weight of these cattle. If you look back through some old beef report data on cattle grazing corn stalks, cattle that were this size and were receiving this amount of supplement should have gained about 1.5 pounds a day. And so whenever we get into the performance data, just keep that in mind. But our grazing period was 56 days long and started on November 7th. We were actually shooting for 70 days, but we had some inclement weather come through and had to shorten the trial. So we grazed it at about 2.04 animal unit months per acre. And just for reference, we were shooting for about 2.65. So we definitely weren't overgrazing on this trial based on the recommendations that are currently made. So a little bit about our sampling. We measured the residue and husk throughout 3 time points on November 7th, December 14th, and then as I mentioned, we had inclement weather, so we had quite a bit of snow out there and weren't able to get out until February 7th to do our final forage sampling. So we were doing really 2 main things. We were accounting for residue distribution and then also doing husk counts. And these pictures on the right side of the screen, they show 2 time points. The top is November with the bottom being January, and then the left being chopped and the right being standard. And looking at these pictures, it's pretty easy to tell that there wasn't any husk left by that January time point whenever those pictures were actually taken. So a little bit of our residue management. So to calculate how much residue was out there, we went the width of one combine pass. And so the reason why we sampled throughout different spots on that was because, as everybody knows, that residue, whenever it comes out the back of the combine, it doesn't come straight out. It comes in more of a fan shape. And so we did, to account for this, we sampled in between rows 1 and 2, 4 and 5, and 7 and 8. And the way that we took these samples was we laid a frame down that was 6.5 square feet. And that frame was basically just a 30-inch row and then that distance again to make a perfect square. And we would collect all of the residue that was on the ground within that frame. And so we did that behind in each one of those spots where the dark red squares represented behind a pass in each different treatment. So for our husk collections, we did the same thing going in the same rows of the in between 1 and 2, 4 and 5, and 7 and 8. We obviously didn't do this where we had taken the frames, so that way it would not interfere with our data. But what we would do is we would lay down a 25-foot measuring tape and then go along and pick up any husk that was between those rows. And this is definitely a good practice to do at home, just to tell how much husk is actually out there if you have the opportunity to. And I think that this knowledge can be really telling of do you actually need to rotate your cattle. So here's a timeline for the study. On October 20th, the corn was harvested, and then on November 7th, we did our first forage sampling. The next day, the grazing trial began, and we did our first diet sample collections with the cannulated animals. And then we did our second samplings on December 14th and 15th, and that snowstorm came through around January 10th. So we ended up having to pull the cattle off and limit fed them for 5 days at that point to gain final weights and determine performance data. And then once that snow finally was gone, we were able to get in and do our final forage sampling and then our final diet sample collections on February 7th and 8th. This is just a picture I threw in here for reference of kind of what it looked like around that January 10th time point. This was on a different study, but this was just kind of what it looked like here in eastern Nebraska. I'm sure people aren't strangers to that here in the upper Midwest. But to get into some of the data, so this is the grazed residue mass. And I know these numbers can maybe look a little daunting and difficult to interpret of how many pounds of residue is actually out there per acre. But in these grazed paddocks, residue mass decreased in both treatments over time, which is something that we would expect. Cattle being out there, they're going to graze that residue off, right? However, at each time point, there was no difference between the two treatments. So November 7th, December 14th, February 7th, the two harvest methods of the standard and the chopped, there was no difference between the two statistically. So this here is our husk counts for 25 feet. So these are the averages in the 8 grazed paddocks. So in the standard, the first time there was 34 versus 27, so there was more, and then we had lost the majority of the husk within the first 5 weeks. By that December 14th sampling date, we were down to less than 2 husks in the standard and far less than 1 husk, and then in the chopped, and then by February 7th, there wasn't anything left. But however, in the ungrazed treatments, we still had about 40 husks left. So our husk counts definitely did go down in the ungrazed, but they still obviously weren't as drastic as in the grazed area. And another thing to note, if you think back to the picture that I showed earlier of the 2 husks and the chopped one looking more frayed, there was about a 1.8 gram difference between the standard, with the standard being heavier than the chopped husk. So there was a little bit of weight difference between those two. In our ungrazed husk mass, there was a difference on November 7th between the chopped and the standard. And part of me wonders if, since this is weight, if that difference was actually just noise in the data from the husks actually being heavier. But then the next two sampling dates tell the same story of what we previously saw on the last slide of no difference between the two treatments. And obviously at the end there was some weathering loss, and we saw a trend with wind blowing some of those husks off of the ungrazed areas. So this is the energy content. This was the husk samples that we pulled from those 25-foot measurements that we made. We then did lab analysis on those and found that energy didn't decrease over time within treatment. However, by February, on the right-hand side there was some loss in quality and also loss in husk. So one thing to keep in mind, if you rotate your cattle to different cornfields throughout the year, the residue that they're grazing in November is going to be still a little bit different than the residue that they're going to be grazing by the time February comes around, even if that ground hasn't been grazed that winter. So we're looking at basically a proxy of total digestible nutrients, or TDN. And so at this first time point, we see it sitting at about 62 to 64%. And then by the end, we're at about 56% on just the husk portion of the plant. So this is the crude protein of the husk. 3.5% isn't hardly anything. So there's really not a whole lot to lose. But we did see that the husk crude protein did not actually decline over time within the treatment. So to go back to our diet samples and the cannulated animals, so this was the TDN that they were receiving as we would turn them out. So we analyzed these and then compared them, and these are basically kind of the averages of what the cattle were actually selecting when they were out there grazing. And so at the beginning, we're at about 55 to 56%. And so that's still, a medium to low quality hay whenever you're sitting there. Once again, no difference within any of these treatments at any point in time. And then by the end, we did see some loss in energy. And so this loss in energy is probably due to that husk being consumed and blowing away, being lost to trampling and things like that. And then for our crude protein did not change over time. But I don't know if you remember the bars from the last time I showed the crude protein here. We're at about 3.5 with a high of 4. On this one, we're never below 4, and we get up as high as about a 5.7. And then finally, as we get in here to the performance, so we didn't see any difference. There is a numerical difference with standard being greater than chopped at 82 hundredths versus 68 hundredths of a pound. But statistically, as a scientist, I can't say there were any differences within the treatment. And so to conclude, the chopping of the residue does not reduce the grazing cattle selectivity and performance. So the data that we saw on the performance really aligns with what we saw of the last data of what I showed you of the energy and the protein between the two. So that was kind of in line. It just wasn't what we thought it was going to be. And remember, as I mentioned, we thought these cattle should have been gaining about 1.5 pounds a day. And they were not, one was less than half and the other was just barely over half that. So we didn't quite meet our target there. We think that might have had something to do with the time that we were limit feeding was just a really hard time for the cattle. So we didn't see that. So we're going to be doing this study again this winter. But there is a slight decrease in the quality of the weather as the winter progresses. So that residue is losing quality, and then you're also going to see loss of husk over winter in ungrazed fields, which is probably no surprise if you drive out on the country roads in the winter and you see it in the bar ditch and the fence lines and different things like that. And so before I wrap up here, I remembered I had forgotten one point that I wanted to make. And that is on this slide. So this is our residue mass from those frames of what was actually out there. And so from this first time point to the second time point, we lost about 9% in both treatments. And then by the end, we had actually lost 30% from the first time point to the last time point. So I think I'd forgotten to say that. I just wanted to make that point before I wrapped up here. But with that, I will take any questions.